Dr. Peter Kreeft is a professor of philosophy at Boston College and has written several books on Christian apologetics and theology. So you'd think that if there was anybody out there who could give a really good argument for the existence of God, he'd be the one to ask. And in fact, he, in partnership with Ronald K. Taselli, has proposed 20 arguments for the existence of God. Well, I can't possibly fail to look at those, can I? But because I want to do this justice, I'm going to do this in 4 videos, each examining 5 of his claims in depth. So let's see how far down the rabbit hole this goes. Now, before I even get started, I want to point out one thing that applies to every single one of his arguments. Absolutely none of them get anywhere remotely close to proving that the Christian God, or any specific God in that matter, actually exists. And that's the problem with every philosophical argument out there. None of them actually get you any closer to proving that any gods are actually real. At best, you get the, there might be something out there, and I'm just going to arbitrarily call it God, which is stupid. So just keep that in mind as we go through these. So let's start off with the first one, the argument from change. Effectively, this argument is that things change, and because things change, something has to cause the changes to happen. Then he goes on to simply assert that there must be something magical that causes all of these changes without ever demonstrating that his assertion is true. And that's the problem I have in general with all of these philosophical arguments, that there's nothing but spin involved. There's never a point at which he takes his assertion and then goes on to objectively demonstrate that his assertion is true. It just never happens. I mean, he uses the example of a woman who grows to be 5'2" and then asks what caused her to do so. Well, lots of things. Intake of food, the breakdown of nutrients, and the growth of cells. That causes her to grow. Both up and out, if you want to think of it that way. There's no God necessary to do any of this. It's just a bald assertion presented with no evidence whatsoever. And then he says that animals move because they have the will and desire. But when they're dead, they don't move no more. And he assumes that God causes this, which is ridiculous. It's like saying that when you combine certain chemicals that are otherwise inert, they become explosive, but only because God makes them that way. It's idiotic, but that's the kind of thinking that we're looking at here. And in the end, he just arbitrarily says, this is one of the things meant by God. Says who? I think it's one of the things meant by biology. But he doesn't like that, so he arbitrarily assigns the label God as though that means something. Why use God? Why not use unicorn? Why not leprechaun? All he's doing is saying, I don't get it, or I don't like it, therefore I'm going to call it God because it makes me feel better. What the hell's wrong with you? And I think you're going to see a lot of that. So let's move on to a second argument, the argument from efficient causality. Effectively, this is the argument of the uncaused cause, which again is never proven to be the Christian God. But a lot of these arguments fall apart for the same reason, because they assume because X, then Y, without ever proving X or Y to be true. Often it's causality and infinite regress, which they simply assert cannot happen. Therefore, their made-up imaginary friend has to be responsible, because reasons. And this is a logical fallacy called affirming the consequent. It operates by claiming that if one thing is true, then another thing is true, and then claiming that the first thing is true, therefore the second thing must be true. And when the original claim is simply wrong, in whole or in part, the whole thing falls apart. For example, we can say, if the Bible is true, then Jerusalem is a real city. Jerusalem is a real city, therefore the Bible is true. Well, the first statement isn't a statement of fact, it's a statement of belief. It's actually another fallacy in and of itself, often called the Spider-Man fallacy. It's so called because the argument that because New York exists, therefore Spider-Man is real, is a demonstrate of the absurdity of the position and a direct corollary of what apologists often say. To have that be a true statement, you'd have to prove that they correlate, which you cannot do. The existence of New York has nothing to do with the existence of Spider-Man. The existence of causality in our universe has nothing to do with the existence of the Christian God. You logically cannot get from A to B. You just can't. And we hit the same logical wall when we look at his third argument, the argument from Time and Causality. He just claims, once again without evidence, that just because things go into and out of existence, that somehow means that there must be something that does not go into and out of existence. Sorry, does not follow. And this is something that is problematic with theology. The idea that you can just make up characteristics about your God and somehow be taken seriously. I mean, these people just come up with characteristics for this unknown and unseen God and declare that they have to be true. How do they know? Where did they get this information? And how did they objectively test it to find out if it was true? This is the way that all theologies work. They state that their gods are a certain way, and because their gods are a certain way, their beliefs are true. But they haven't shown that their gods even exist, much less have any specific characteristics about which we can have any rational discussions over. My God is X? How do you know? Prove it. You haven't actually demonstrated anything worthwhile. So again, we have an argument that's just a bald assertion rolled in with affirming the consequent and a Spider-Man fallacy for good measure. Theistic arguments are just fallacy piled upon fallacy piled upon fallacy. I want X to be true, so I'll claim X is true because I want X to be true. But logic doesn't work that way. Just because you want something to be true doesn't mean that it's true, and all the philosophical masturbation in the world won't change that. And it doesn't get any better. We move on to his fourth argument, the argument from degrees of perfection, and we see the exact same pattern. He arbitrarily asserts that we cannot have any view of perfection unless there's one ultimate standard of perfection. He arbitrarily asserts that standard of perfection must be his God, and then he attacks anyone who points out the absurdity of it all by saying, just asking if this is ridiculous proves it's not. Apologists use ridicule as a weapon, where when you point out the legitimate failings of their arguments, they say that your actions just prove their arguments are true. They don't actually answer the questions because they don't have any actual answers. They just have feelings and blind faith and are emotionally incapable of thinking beyond those boundaries. Finally, this time, we'll look at the design argument, which at least isn't as obviously weak as the rest he's chosen to start with. But it isn't a good argument because it simply asserts that design exists without demonstrating it, and then claims that his God must have been the designer, again without proving it. So he argues the following points. 1. The universe displays a staggering amount of intelligibility, both within the things we observe and in the way that these things relate to others outside themselves. That is to say, the way they exist and coexist display an intricately beautiful order and regularity that can fill even the most casual observer with wonder. It is the norm in nature for many different beings to work together to produce the same valuable end. For example, the organs in the body work for our life and health. Number 2, either this intelligible order is the product of chance or of intelligent design. Number 3, not chance. Number 4, therefore, the universe is the product of intelligent design. 5, design comes only from a mind, a designer. 6, therefore, the universe is the product of an intelligent designer. So, there are problems here we can't even begin to fathom. He starts off saying that isn't it so wonderful that the universe is such a nice place to be? Then he makes a false dichotomy. It's either random chance or an intelligent designer. Then he arbitrarily declares it's not chance. Then he says it has to be an intelligent designer and goes on from there. And people fall for this. It's designed to appeal to the emotional mind of the believer, not the rational mind of the skeptic. And they claim that this is the way that it is. Okay, when are you going to get around to proving it? You're not? No surprise there. Because you've got nothing with which to prove your claim. No actual objective evidence that shows that anything you say has any validity whatsoever. And if it has no validity, why should anyone take you seriously? They shouldn't. But as with the vast majority of apologetics, this isn't intended to prove anything to the non-believers. It's only meant to reinforce the blind faith that the believers have by making them think that their beliefs have something to them, when in reality, they just don't. Now, I trust you're seeing a pattern here because this is the core of religious apologetics. Make an unsupported claim that appeals to the believer, introduce a false dichotomy or other logical fallacy, then declare that you've won without ever going through the steps to reach a reasonable victory. Because like I said, this isn't about proving anything to the skeptics. They know they can't, and they just don't care. This is about reinforcing blind faith among the religiously gullible, people who don't know any better and simply don't care. And the apologists don't care either, even if they do know better, because their job is selling books to the rubes who just want those comforting lies to tell them that what they already believe is true. And these shyster apologists think the skeptics don't see right through their bullshit, or they just don't care as long as the rubes never catch on. That's why we see so many preachers and faith healers and other scam artists coming out of the religion field and saying, yeah, they knew they were spouting nonsense all along. This isn't a secret. Why the religious are so dumb that they keep falling for it is beyond me. So we'll get into his next 5 arguments the next time around. Sorry to say, they're not going to be any more convincing or rational than these have been because religious apologetics are, by their very nature, absurd and irrational. There's simply nothing worthwhile there. Every argument gets demolished by exposing it to the light of day, and the apologetic cockroaches just scurry off to get back to their clueless flock because that's where the money is. Do I have to say how sad this is? I didn't think so. Welcome back to part 2 of Dr. Peter Kreft's really horrible arguments for God. If you thought there were some really ridiculous ideas in the first part, you ain't seen nothing yet. And that's the problem. If you really take some of these arguments apart and look at them critically, they're universally awful. They make no sense of any kind to anyone with half a clue. And that's because they're not intended to appeal to anyone with an ounce of sense. They're intended to appeal to people who already believe and who therefore are not very critical. So let's see some more claims made for people who don't know any better as we examine 5 more bad arguments for God. We'll start out with argument number 6, the Kalam argument. Now, I've addressed Kalam before, and if you want to see that in detail, please go see my other video, which I'll put in the description. Therefore, I'll do the short version. He starts out by saying that whatever begins to exist has a cause for coming into existence. In fact, he requires this premise to be accepted so much that he suggests that anybody who doesn't agree must be insane. But that doesn't stop it from being an unwarranted assumption upon which he hangs the rest of the argument. But we'll leave that for a moment and move on. He says the universe began to exist and then uses Big Bang cosmology to prove it. But does that prove that the universe actually began out of nothing? No, it does not. All I have to do is propose an alternative and his entire argument falls apart. I don't even have to prove that my alternative actually happened because his whole argument rests on his assertion that there are no other alternatives possible. So if I say that the universe could have gone through an unending sequence of big bangs and big crunches forever, assuming that forever has any meaning in the absence of time, the whole Kalam cosmological argument disintegrates because now the sequence needs no cause because the sequence had no beginning, and causality is something that exists only within a particular set of physical laws, which now isn't a known quantity. We simply don't know of anything that didn't begin to exist based on the physical laws of our particular universe. And that means that asserting a God which didn't begin to exist is absurd if you want to assert that our set of physical laws is all that there is, which is what he's doing. Causality either exists everywhere, which he's asserting, and therefore God cannot be without a beginning, or it does not, which God being without a beginning suggests, and the whole argument becomes laughable. You can't suggest that there's an exception to a rule that has no exceptions. But once you introduce an exception, you have to allow for lots of potential exceptions. And once you allow for lots of potential exceptions, there goes your argument. Moving on to number 7, the argument from contingency. This is a sad one, but then again, they're all sad. The basic argument, as they say, is simple. Number 1, if something exists, there must exist what it takes for that thing to exist. Number 2, the universe, the collection of beings in space and time, exists. And I think it's funny he calls it beings instead of things, but whatever. Number 3, therefore, there must exist what it takes for the universe to exist. Number 4, what it takes for the universe to exist cannot exist within the universe or be bounded by space and time. And number 5, therefore, what it takes for the universe to exist must transcend both space and time. So what does any of that actually mean? Well, not a whole lot if you want to be honest about it. It really says that if something exists, then the things that allow that thing to exist must exist. He then goes on to give an example that you, as a living being, require air to breathe and thus stay alive, thus air must exist in order for you to exist. Okay, fine. But air is part of space and time, therefore what it requires for me to exist does not have to transcend both space and time, does it? And even though our universe exists with its own space and its own time, that doesn't mean that our space and our time is the only space and time out there. In fact, science is pretty certain that there's a multitude of other universes out there, each with their own space and their own time and their own physical laws. Hence, whatever it takes for our universe to exist doesn't mean it's a god. And yes, he does address that, but it's clear how ridiculous he's being. He answers a question in which it's asked, why should we call this cause God? Maybe it's just unknown. And he says, and I quote, true, and this unknown is God. Because he says it is. Sorry, you can't get from there to here with, because I say so. But that's all he's got. It's just a load of pithy sounding nonsense and an invented solution to all the problems that comes right out of his own asshole. Moving on to number 8. The argument from the world as an interacting whole. One crazy person got an argument from another crazy person, and he thinks he's got a winner. He says that this argument comes from Norris Clark, who taught metaphysics and the philosophy of religion at Fordham University in New York. Sure, metaphysics is imaginary, and the philosophy of believing in things that cannot be demonstrated to be true is laughable. But let's continue. It argues that because the world operates via seemingly universal physical laws, that the individual parts cannot be understood except as components of the whole, and because the parts rely on the whole thing is an unintelligible mess without God. They're just arbitrarily assigning this God figure to their pile of pseudo-intellectual bullshit because reasons. Essentially, it's another case of, I don't get it, so I'm going to explain it in emotionally comforting terms that I likewise don't understand. Now, we note that they use the term transcendent creative mind, which really doesn't mean anything. I mean, I suppose they use it as a code word for God, so people like me can't point out that they have no means of getting from their philosophical masturbatory position to the theological position they really want to get to. You'll notice this happens all the time in apologetics, where they'll use generic code words so they can whisper in the ear of the believer, but what we really mean is God. It's ridiculous. Number 9, the argument from miracles. This one is just painful, but it's honestly not any worse than anything else he said. It just goes to show how stupid this list of proofs for God actually is. Here he argues that because miracles happen, God exists. And yeah, that's every bit as stupid as it sounds. So here's his argument. Number 1, a miracle is an event whose only adequate explanation is the extraordinary and direct intervention of God. Number 2, there are numerous well-attested miracles. Number 3, therefore, there are numerous events whose only adequate explanation is the extraordinary and direct intervention of God. Number 4, therefore God exists. Now this whole thing falls apart immediately because he's just trying to define God into existence. He argues that miracles are the product of God. Says who? Why can't we just assume that miracles must be the product of unicorns or leprechauns? Why does it have to be his God? It simply does not follow. And then he goes on to say that there are numerous well-attested miracles. Where? Where are they? There are numerous claimed miracles, but none of them can be objectively demonstrated to actually be miracles. And how would you go about proving that it was a miracle in the first place? Not having an explanation doesn't mean it has no explanation. It only means you haven't determined what happened yet. I don't know does not mean God did it. Besides, who determines what an adequate explanation is? I can't imagine that God is an adequate explanation for anything because God hasn't been shown to exist in the first place. This is really just argument from bald assertion. Why can't I say, well, the only adequate explanation is the extraordinary and direct intervention of aliens? How is that any different from what he does here? He hasn't proven that any miracles have, in fact, demonstrably taken place. He just points to his own ignorance and slaps a label on events he doesn't understand. And then he just pulls a cause for these events straight out of his ass and declares he's proven God exists. What a fucking idiot. All right, number 10, the argument from consciousness. Here, he argues that when we experience the tremendous order and intelligibility of the universe, we are experiencing something intelligence can grasp. So what? We evolved as part of the universe. It only makes sense that we should be able to understand, at least to a certain degree, the workings of the universe that we evolved to be part of. But here again, he comes up with an absurd list of criteria that we should be getting painfully used to. Number 1. We experience the universe as intelligible. This intelligibility means that the universe is graspable by intelligence. Number 2, either this intelligible universe and the finite mind so well suited to grasp it are the products of intelligence, or both intelligibility and intelligence are the products of blind chance. Number 3, not blind chance. Number 4, therefore, this intelligible universe and the finite mind so well suited to grasp it are the products of intelligence. Of course, number 3 is something he does virtually every time. He simply arbitrarily eliminates the option he doesn't like, simply because he doesn't like it. He never actually shows that it isn't the case. He just throws it out because he feels like it. For the rest, he just appeals to a false dichotomy that there are only 2 options, and because he arbitrarily throws one out, the other one must be true. But that's not how logical reasoning actually works. The only way for a proposition to be considered true is if that proposition is actually demonstrated to be true. It doesn't get to be the automatic winner because it's all that's left over from an arbitrary list of choices. So because he fails, pathetically, to show that the universe is actually a product of intelligence, this is just as much nonsense as pretty much everything else he spews. Geez, this is painful to go through, especially knowing that the religious will take everything I say and just ignore it because it's inconvenient. Because they're not really interested in the truth. They just want to feel good about the nonsense they already believe. And apologists like Kreft make a lot of money spinning nonsensical yarns to the credulous who just want a pat on the head and an ego stroking so they can go back to being delusional idiots. Well, newsflash for you morons. It doesn't matter how your beliefs make you feel. It only matters if they're actually true. And if these arguments are anything to go by, I wouldn't be holding my breath. But anyway, I'll be back with part 3 soon. I'm sure you just can't wait to hear what gems of religious wisdom Dr. Peter Kreft has to present. Welcome to part 3 of Dr. Peter Kreft's Arguments for God, where I'll take on and completely demolish another 5 of his 20 claims, which are so horribly and irrationally put together that I've got no idea how a supposedly educated man could ever have thought any of them were a good idea. But he's not operating out of his education, but out of his blind faith, and holy crap does it show. I really don't know what else to say, except hold on to your butts, because this is about to get stupid. After a while, it feels like he's not even trying. In fact, I think he betrays the fact that these are not actually arguments at all, just ideas that might appeal to certain people in certain situations, so he might as well throw them all out there. He says that this one might appeal to someone who shares a Platonic view of knowledge, someone who already believes that there are eternal intelligible forms. In fact, he actually argues that this is a bad argument because there's too much about the theory of knowledge that needs to be said, and presumably understood, before this can be used as a persuasive demonstration. So why is it in his list of 20 arguments for God? Doesn't he know how to proofread? But hey, we're here anyway. Let's take a look at it. Now he says it comes mostly from Augustine, and he's phrased it as such. 1. Our limited minds can discover eternal truths about being. 2. Truth properly resides in a mind. 3. But the human mind is not eternal. 4. Therefore, there must exist an eternal mind in which these truths reside. Now, you'd have to define what you mean by eternal truths about being. Such as, because I'd honestly argue that these truths are often nonsense. Philosophically, truths are not the same as facts. Facts exist externally to the observer. Truths depend on the observer for context, and that makes truth subjective. What is true for one person may not be true for another, and that makes it very problematic for purposes of coming to an objective view of reality. He goes on to say that truth properly resides in a mind. Well, since truth is questionable at best and completely subjective at worst, what's the point? Now I went looking for a definition of what a eternal truth about being might be and came back with ideas from Descartes and Augustine, but they all read like personal opinions, not like anything that can be demonstrated to be actually so. So really, the idea that opinions can only reside in a mind might be true, but since these opinions are just overblown nonsense, calling them eternal truths about being is just silly. And so it goes, like so many of these other arguments, just defining some God figure into existence, it just has to be there. But it doesn't. It's just patently absurd hyper-emotionalism. I've got these ideas, and I want to think that they're bigger than myself, so I'll arbitrarily invent something to have these ideas for me. And you think that's somehow impressive. I mean, Jesus, talk about an overblown sense of self-importance. But it only gets worse from there. The next one argues that we could never come up with the idea of God unless God was real. Yeah, I'll let that one sink in for a moment while we look at his actual argument that he takes from Descartes. 1. We have ideas of many things. 2. These ideas must arise either from ourselves or from things outside us. 3. One of the ideas that we have is the idea of God, an infinite, all-perfect being. 4. This idea could not have been caused by ourselves because we know ourselves to be limited and imperfect, and no effect can be greater than its cause. 5. Therefore, the idea must have been caused by something outside us, which has nothing less than the qualities contained in the idea of God. 6. But only God himself has those qualities. 7. Therefore, God himself must be the cause of the ideas we have of him. 8. Therefore, God exists. Now, I'm going to say one word that totally blows this entire load of philosophical masturbation out of the water. You ready for this? Superman. Because humans are such limited, imperfect beings that we could never, ever, ever come up with the idea of a man who can leap tall buildings with a single bound. Yes, Siegel and Schuster couldn't have come up with that on their own, so they must have been modeling Superman after a real being. I mean, it's not like we could have thought up the concept of flying cars, because we all know that cars don't fly. Therefore, they must. In fact, every single thing that humans have imagined that didn't exist must have already existed, or we couldn't have come up with it, because humans are stupid, at least according to Kreft and his religious cronies. Nope, somebody might be stupid here, and I'll give you 3 guesses who it might be. Alright. Let's get on to something else because those last 2 were just painfully idiotic. This one is Anselm's ontological argument, which I've taken on before, but hey, I might as well do another workup here. It says, 1. It is greater for a thing to exist in the mind and in reality than in the mind alone. 2. God means that than which a greater cannot be thought. 3. Suppose that God exists in the mind but not in reality. 4. Then a greater than God could be thought, namely a being that has all the qualities our thought of God has, plus real existence. 5. But this is impossible, for God is that than which a greater cannot be thought. 6. Therefore God exists in the mind and in reality. Right off the bat, I'd ask how you define greater. For that matter, the definition provided for God is not what he says it is. I can find absolutely no dictionary that defines the word God that way. But I can take this argument out exactly the same way I did with the previous one. Superman! It is far greater that Superman exists in reality than in the mind alone. Therefore, Superman must exist. And flying cars, and super powerful aliens, and every other thing man has ever conceived of. All of it must exist because apparently it's far greater for these things to actually exist in reality than only in the mind of man. And this is something that's been known since Anselm proposed this argument. We can go back to the very first person who ever responded to it, who said that it's impossible that the most maximally beautiful island does not exist in reality because it's better to exist in reality than in the mind. And Anselm even admitted that his argument relied on the ambiguity of the terms he used. But beyond that, this relies on the common apologetic tool of defining God into existence. See, there's no way to actually prove that this God thing has any of the characteristics that theists arbitrarily assign to it. Theists have no means of pointing to any actual God and studying it to find out what characteristics it actually has. Therefore, those characteristics are just made up, just like the characteristics Siegel and Schuster made up when they made Superman. Theists have no means of proving that what they say is actually so, and we have no reason to take any of it seriously. If I say that Superman is the maximally great man and therefore must exist, that doesn't mean Superman exists. This whole thing is just painfully stupid. But the pain goes on and on and on as we move to the moral argument. Krefft states it as such. 1. Real moral obligation is a fact. We are really truly objectively obligated to do good and avoid evil. 2. Either the atheistic view of reality is correct or the religious one. 3. But the atheistic one is incompatible with there being moral obligation. 4. Therefore, the religious view of reality is correct. First off, prove that moral obligation is a fact. Go ahead, because I don't think that any apologist can actually defend that view. From a social standpoint, yes, we are expected to do what society views as good and to avoid doing what society views as evil. This is the very basis for legality, but objectively obligated? I don't think you have any means for making that claim. But as expected, he follows his typical course and engages in a false dichotomy. Either the atheist view or the religious view is right, and he arbitrarily disposes of the atheist view and declares himself to be the victor. Sorry, nobody with half a clue is impressed. So let's actually dig a little deeper and see why theists are so wrong on this issue. The problem is, there's no such thing as objective morality. Theists don't like that, but I've talked about this many times before, and no theist has ever been able to say more than, "I'm right, so there." There's simply no evidence for a single objectively defensible moral standard throughout space and across time. It just doesn't exist. The idea that there is completely intellectually indefensible. But they don't operate on intellect. They operate on emotion, and that's why they get into trouble. The basis for all morality, when you get right down to it, is enlightened self-interest. We all want to be treated well. Therefore, we treat others well in hopes that they will reciprocate. As the individual views of what being treated well means changes, society's views on morality changes as well. What was seen as being moral a century ago, or even a decade ago, might now be seen as being immoral. This has happened in every single human society in the existence of our planet, and it's absolutely not what we would expect to see if there was a single objective standard for morality. In that case, we'd expect to see moral stagnation. We'd expect to see the same moral standards everywhere on the planet at all times. Nothing would ever change. It wouldn't matter what country you were talking about. It wouldn't matter what culture you were talking about. It wouldn't matter what religion you were talking about. They'd all be the same because, as Christians like to say, morality would be written on the human heart. But that's not what we observe. That has never been what we observed. Therefore, theists have to come up with some excuse for why what we see in the real world doesn't match what they believe. This is called self-deception. They're desperately trying to rationalize away reality in favor of their religious fantasies. These people are delusional. Finally, this time around, let's look at the argument from conscience. This is actually a twist on the moral argument, and therefore suffers from most of the same problems. It argues that because we have a conscience at all, that some kind of God must exist. And this is, of course, complete bullshit. Kreeft argues that there are 4 places a conscience can come from. 1, from something less than me, which he calls nature. 2, from me, the individual. 3, from others equal to me, society. And 4, from something over me, God. And then he tries to dispose of the ones he doesn't like in favor of the one he does. For the first, he asks, how can I be absolutely obligated by something less than me? For example, by animal instinct or practical need for material survival. Who said anything about obligation? He wonders why animals have instincts, like they constantly ask themselves, well, I really don't want to follow my instincts, but I have this grand moral obligation to do so. Yeah, Peter Kreeft is an idiot. They don't follow it because they have a choice. They follow it because it's programmed by evolution into their genes. Humans have instincts too, although we have, through our big mammalian brains, developed the ability to override our instincts. We, like every other animal on the planet, have a biological drive to reproduce. We want to breed. We just have the ability, if we choose, not to do so. We can opt out of our instincts. That doesn't mean they go away. It just means we have a choice. Next, he says, how can I obligate myself absolutely? Am I absolute? Do I have the right to demand absolute obedience from anyone, even myself? And if I am the one who locked myself into this prison of obligation, I can also just let myself out, thus destroying the absoluteness of the obligation which we admitted in our premise. Again, he's stuck with this whole obligation thing, which is still ridiculous. There is no obligation to do anything. You can reject morality and conscience if you want. In fact, that's exactly what sociopaths do. There are moral nihilists out there who reject the idea that anything is inherently moral or immoral. Some argue that Machiavelli is an example of moral nihilism, although I guess I would question that. Next, he says, how can society obligate me? What right do my equals have to impose their values on me? Does quantity equal quality? Do a million human beings make a relative into an absolute? Is society God? Well, yeah, society does obligate you because humans are inherently social creatures that require society to live. This is actually the answer, but it's not the one he's looking for. Society has the ability to compel you to follow their rules and penalize you if you choose not to. The simple fact is, you need society a lot more than society needs you. A million people might not make a relative into an absolute, but that's because there aren't any absolute moral views. It certainly can make an option into a requirement, which is all that's required. And finally, he softballs the final option with, the only source of absolute moral obligation left is something superior to me, that binds my will, morally, with rightful demands of complete obedience. But that assumes that there are moral obligations at all, which clearly there are not. Ultimately, this is a version of his false dichotomy arguments because he just arbitrarily rejects the other positions in favor of the one he wants. He's never actually demonstrated that the one he wants is actually true. But what else is new? That's really where all this becomes such a mess, because Kreeft and other apologists aren't actually concerned with proving the existence of their gods. They just want to play word games and convince the credulous that their ideas have some merit. Except they don't. If anything, it just proves that these people have no clue what the hell they're talking about. And that comes as no surprise. I mean, they fall for every logical fallacy under the sun. They make claims that are unsupported, they make arguments that are absurd, and they come to conclusions that are simply not backed up by their supposed evidence. These people are fucked up, and proudly so. How so many people are so gullible to take any of this nonsense seriously, I will never understand. Finally, we come to the last 5 of Dr. Peter Kreft's apologetic arguments that are meant to show that God is real. But they really only show that Christians are idiots. Who in their right mind could take any of this nonsense seriously? It isn't like it's hard to poke massive holes in these claims. Anybody can do it if they have the right kind of education or any intelligence whatsoever. So why do Christians believe? Because they care more about feelings and not at all about facts. And shysters like Kreft play into that gullibility to make really bad arguments for God. So let's get started. So we'll start off this time with a prime example of theistic dumbfuckery, the argument from desire. Now he defines it as such. 1. Every natural innate desire in us corresponds to some real object that can satisfy that desire. 2. But there exists in us a desire which nothing in time, nothing on earth, no creature can satisfy. 3. Therefore there must exist something more than time, earth, and creatures which can satisfy this desire. 4. This something is what people call God and life with God forever. Except the premise is absurd on its face. You know, we've got these people called inventors. You can also throw in fiction writers and artists if you want to, but I'm going to stick with inventors. They desire for things that don't exist, thus they create it. They wanted things that weren't real, so they went out and made them real. That's how creativity works. He can't be this fucking dumb, can he? Besides, he says that there exists within us a desire for God. Says who? I've got no desire for his imaginary friend. In fact, if you start with absolutely no concept for his God, you'll never get there. Even with people who want a God, and the desire for gods comes from fear, not desire, but even if you start with people who want a God, but have never heard of any of the gods that infest our planet, the gods they come up with will not be like anything we already have. They just won't. They will be a completely new creation, just like all the imaginary gods we have now. Because whether he likes it or not, these gods are all just made up. There's no reason to think that any of these gods actually exist in reality. And that's something I've pointed out in the past, that none of these arguments actually get you to any specific gods. They can't. They can only get you to some vague, generic something. You can't get from that to any specific god, period. Even if you could establish that this innate desire shows that there must be some real object out there, and you can't, but even if you could, you couldn't prove that that object was the Christian God, or any other God. So these arguments don't even get you anywhere worthwhile. It's just idiotic. So let's move on. This one is so absurdly stupid, he doesn't even bother to explain it. He just says that you either get it or you don't. And nobody with a single functional brain cell gets it. He says that just because beautiful music exists, or beautiful anything for that matter, that there's some God. And that doesn't mean that there's some God. Geez, and I thought Kreft was stupid before, but this one takes the cake. But I guess it does show just how stupid religious apologetics really are. If Bach, then God. How about if Bach, then Santa Claus? It makes just about as much sense. It really betrays the complete lack of intellect involved in any of these arguments. It's all about emotion. If you're not emotionally invested in these arguments, they sound utterly stupid. Because they are! Unfortunately, as I've said before, these lists never get any better. Every argument is just as pointless and foolish as the last. And that brings us to the argument from religious experience, which again is laughably stupid. He says it's difficult to state this argument deductively, but he tries when he says, 1. Many people of different eras and widely different cultures claim to have had an experience of the divine. 2. It is inconceivable that so many people could have been so utterly wrong about the nature and content of their own experience. 3, therefore there exists a divine reality in which many people of different eras and of widely different cultures have experienced. Unfortunately, while there are lots of people who claim to have had an experience with the divine, there's absolutely nobody who can objectively prove that they actually have. I mean, there's people out there who have claimed to have had experiences with Bigfoot or aliens. Does that prove that Bigfoot or aliens are actually real? Of course not! And that's the problem. People are just arbitrarily declaring that their experiences had to be with God. Can they prove that it was? Nope. All they can do is say something weird happened, and therefore, God did it. That's not an argument. That's an assertion. How can you objectively verify this assertion? Well, you can't! Which is why every time someone tells me about their experiences with God, I have to ask them how they know it was God. How do they know it wasn't the devil or some other pantheon sent to lead them away from the one true path? How do they objectively differentiate between the two? Well, they can't. They can only make the empty claim that somehow, in some way they can't explain, they just know it was their particular God. And we've got no reason whatsoever to take that seriously. So let's move along to the common consent argument. I'll just let him set this up, which he does thusly. 1. Belief in God, that being to whom reverence and worship are properly due, is common in almost all people of every era. 2. Either the vast majority of people have been wrong about this most profound element of their lives, or they have not. 3. It is most plausible to believe that they have not. 4. Therefore, it is most plausible to believe that God exists. Oh look, another false dichotomy. I'm sure we're all real surprised. In fact, this reminds me a lot of C.S. Lewis's liar, lunatic, Lord argument, where he declares that there are only a few options, then he arbitrarily dismisses the ones he doesn't like, and declares the remaining one to be true. Except he misses a lot like legend, which is the most objectively likely possibility. So here, Krefft does the same thing as he usually does in declaring that there are only two options, throwing one of them out, and then pretending that the remaining option must be true. Of course, he has no evidence for that. All he has is his empty bullshit claim, so he waves his arms around and cooks the books so that he can pretend that the option he wanted all along has got to be it. And that's not how logic works. Whether most people have believed in some sort of God throughout history is irrelevant. I mean, people believe the earth was flat too. In fact, some still do. These people are just wrong. He's just engaged in argumentum ad populum, that because lots of people believed it, therefore it's got to be true. No, it does not. And of all the billions of people that have ever lived, and that number's about 107 billions for those who are curious, the majority have believed in some other god than his. Now, I've got no idea how accurate this is, but I've seen estimates that say that throughout history, 1,376,000,000 people have been Christian. So even if his fallacious logic was sound, that's only a tiny percentage of people who've been Christian throughout history. So why should we believe in his God again? I don't know. And finally, we come to Pascal's wager, which is a pretty pathetic place to leave the list. But since every single one of his claims have been terminally flawed, why the hell not? Pascal's wager isn't even an argument for the existence of God. It's a fallacious argument from consequences. You don't lose anything by believing, and you potentially lose a lot by not believing, so you might as well believe. Except it's not that simple. Pascal's wager engages in the theist's favorite fallacy, the false dichotomy once again. There are only two options, either their God or no gods. But we all know that's stupid, so let's try that one again. How many gods are there in theory? Well, nobody really knows. I mean, the Hindus have 33 gods on their own, the ancient Hittites had over 1,000, so that's going to throw a wrench into things. Currently, there's about 4,200 religions on the planet, and extrapolating that into history, that gives us about 63,000 different religions, assuming that the number has remained relatively constant. Ancient religions had more gods than modern religions, and modern religions, which tend to be monotheistic, are relatively few in number. So, just for shits and giggles, if we average out Hinduism, the Hittites, and modern religions, we get about 367 gods per religion, or 23,121,000 gods overall. So let's just round that down to 23 million. So that means that Christians have a 1 in 23 million chance that their God is the one true God, assuming there's one true God at all. I mean, for all we know, all 23 million gods could be real. Or half of them, or none of them. There's simply no evidence that any gods of any kind exist in reality. Regardless, this takes their nice safe wager and flushes it down the proverbial toilet. Because now, it's not safe to believe in their God, or any God, based on the odds. And of course, that doesn't take into account all the possible gods, the ones man has never gotten around to making up, so the odds are now just astronomical. Even if we assume that the number of conceivable gods is 1% of the ones we've ever had believers in, we're now talking about 1.25 trillion odds of getting the right one, if there even is a right one. So please, tell us how you have nothing to lose in picking one of them at random. Go ahead. But it gets worse, because belief is not subject to the will. You can't just pick a god to believe in because you cannot choose your belief. You have to be convinced of it. So at best, you'd have to pretend to believe in a god, and seriously, do you think your god's really that stupid? Wouldn't they know that you're only playing the odds? Is any god who doesn't know that worth bowing down to in the first place? I certainly wouldn't think so. So you can't just pretend to believe in 23 million gods in the hope that you just might get lucky. Who the hell's got time for that? It just makes Pascal's wager so ridiculous. It makes me wonder who could be so stupid to buy into it. Oh yeah, Dr. Peter Kreeft. And this is really why religious apologetics are so fucking stupid. I mean, this is the best they can do. These are the best arguments they can come up with. Every single solid one of them falls apart under the most cursory of evaluation. They're so chock full of fallacies and unsupported claims that are designed to appeal to the believer who just won't think too hard, or at all, about any of it. Because if you look at it, you have to burst out laughing. I mean, seriously, what the hell is wrong with these people? Oh yeah, they're not thinking about what they believe. They don't care if it's really true, so long as it gives them an emotional high. They're going to embrace it because feeling good is all they want. Facts? Fuck facts! Give me feels! If this doesn't prove to people that theists are emotionally hyperactive children, I don't know what will. And we have the apologists to thank for showing us, because they present these ludicrous arguments as if anyone should take them seriously. Unfortunately, far too many do, which makes me weep for humanity. And maybe it should make you weep too.